Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. We created this podcast to share the wonderful people we get to interact with, we get to meet, we get to know, and most importantly, get to learn from. So I invite you to join us on this journey here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. Is that the one and only, the multi-talented Sandy Climan?
You know, I may be one and only because I am not multi-talented. And all I can tell you is you are the multi-talented one. I try to change things for the better through storytelling. You truly change things for the better because all of your products have nourished not only us in sustenance, but in spirit.
Now I got a paid endorsement. You're probably a member of the Screen Actors Guild. You're going to cost me a fortune as I broadcast your comments around the world. Thanks very much.
And, you always had emotion behind the business from its beginning, because how could you be in the flower business and not have emotion behind the business? Mm-hmm. But you've added this sort of contextual layer of emotion and happiness, and you've built a community. And I know that, whether it's the podcast that you're doing, and I've enjoyed listening to all of them. I just, bought Vicky Ward's book, The Liar's Ball.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Actually, I went online after listening to one of your podcasts with her, and I said, oh my gosh, I really want to read this book. Fantastic stuff.
I spoke about you earlier today because Vicky Ward, our friend and an investigative reporter and journalist, came up in a conversation. She explained to me that she did a story a couple of years ago, and she worked like a dog on it. And she said she put 6 months of her life into it, night and day, weekends, and wrote this great story and had it published in a magazine. I won't say which one. And they paid her the most that they pay anyone for a story, which was $25,000.
Which, by the way, is a lot of money.
Think of your experiences in the entertainment industry, how you changed how your clients range from Robert De Niro to Robert Redford, Kevin Costner, Danny DeVito, Michael Mann, just an amazing roster of people that you developed good long-term relationships. And you taught them and took them by the hand and showed them how to monetize those brands and how to develop their brands to be the kinds of opportunities they wanted to be. And now journalists have to think like you thought many years ago in the entertainment industry about, okay, if I have an idea and I'm going to go put 6 months into this idea, I better be pretty sure what the audience is and what the monetization capabilities are. So she's thinking about, is this idea, who's my print partner? Is it worthy of a book, perhaps? Is it worthy of a feature film, a documentary, an audio, a podcast series? Is there another serialized version? And so she has to think as an entrepreneur now, not just as a journalist, but as an entrepreneur. I had this seedling idea, and she has to be her own agent, or will there be agencies that develop who represent talent like that to help them to monetize appropriately their hard work?
Well, firstly, let me just say, Robert Redford, Robert De Niro, Kevin Costner, Danny DeVito, Michael Mann, and everyone else I worked with, because I helped run CAA for 12 years. They taught me, and I learned from them. And, look, I'm just a kid from the Bronx. And, I remember in Powerhouse, I was talking about that early days where Redford picked me up on the side of the road making the Milagro Beanfield War. And I get I was like on the side of a road with nothing there. And I get into the car, and, looks at me and he says, "You seem perplexed." To which I said, "Well, look, I'm just a kid from the Bronx and you're Robert Redford." And I said, "I'm just a Jewish kid." He said, "I'm Jewish too." And while he is not, and people have asked that question, he has many of the neuroses that make you very much able to do the things he does in the characters he has portrayed. But I'll tell you what I learned, and then we'll get to Vicky. One of my favorite stories was with De Niro. And, people would say, how do you talk to De Niro? I said, well, I talk to him every day. And I said, or every other day. And he's just a great human being. All of the people I worked with were compassionate people who were extraordinarily kind, extraordinarily thoughtful about everyone around them and their business, and their values were extraordinary. If there was a mistake, I remember once there was a mistake made in a contract, we won't go into which one, and the attorney said to me, "We're not going to point it out." And I said, "Yes, we are." And he said, "No, we're not." I said, "You're going to point it out, or I'm going to call the client, and he's going to tell you to point it out, because we are in a relationship with the people we do business with.
Right.
And we don't take advantage of them. They will eventually figure it out. And what are you going to do?" And explain to them that, we didn't save the time on their part and our part by doing the right thing. But I remember De Niro was making what were small films, Jackknife, Stanley and Iris. Probably the most renowned of that era was This Boy's Life, which was a remarkable film. And he gave me a script. And, I did a lot of things. I did business, I did agenting, I helped run the agency. And I never, it was always a privilege, because I always thought it's the imposter syndrome. Why are you allowed to do this? and it was a particularly grisly script. I sort of remember snow, blood, stuff like that. The word non-commercial came to mind. And I said to him, as opposed to what many agents would say, which is, "Don't do it," I said, "What do you see in the part?" And he said, "There's something in the character I've never experienced, and I want to have that experience." So it was a pure artist. I didn't go to film school. That's a pure artist. That's someone who is living their life through the roles they play to make themselves a more complete person and actor. And they want to learn from the part. And I think that with a Vicky Ward or others, in a way, they're now in the role of managing their own persona. But to me, there are several changes. There are people who help, journalists. But long ago, I said to the then CEO of the New York Times, "You have an amazing brand, but the brands you manage are going to be as important as your brand." Yeah, and so there's that. And then the other thing is, which I think is unprecedented, I was just at Davos, and what are we reading now? Politico, Axios, Semaphore just launched. We had Steve Clemens at the dinner we hosted. Ben Smith was at the Lazard Foursquare conference. And brilliant writers and investigative reporters can now build something they've never been able to build before. Everyone, including talent. We're no longer dealing with audiences and intermediaries. We are dealing directly with communities that you build. Yes. The audience is now a community, which is what you're doing with 1-800-Flowers. And a Vicky Ward, if she manages it properly, as Andrew has, you find this direct communication with people who so care about the important work that you do. And remember, we don't need large audiences to make good living. Substack tried to do that, and they did well. And Newsbreak is trying to do that and bring back local journalism. But at the end of the day, the ability to reach people who care authentically is our antidote to the misinformation that is often out there. And without brands like Vicky or Andrew or, many, many, many other, Goody Fareed Zakaria, you don't have the ability to undo the misinformation, because when I was growing up, and this will show my age, Walter Cronkite, if Walter Cronkite said something, you believed it.
Absolutely.
Now you can have not national audiences on CBS, but smaller audiences, and have a good living out of it. And as you build them, maybe they become a national audience like CBS.
Well, what you say reminds me of our friend Seth Godin, who talks about the smallest viable audience. And he just turns the funnel upside down and said, what's the smallest audience you could have that's interested in what you're doing that makes it economically viable? And that's what you should target. Anything above that is gravy. But it's the way you guys who are smart think about turning it upside down. And I know Axios, Semaphore that you mentioned, I think what Axios is doing is just terrific. And the subjects they're getting into, you and I have talked a lot about things that are interest to us in terms of mental health, loneliness epidemic that's going on. And Axios has been doing some great writing in that area and reporting and providing just genuine information and service to their community.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, I highly recommend everybody listening, if they haven't done so already, to download Michael Wolff's Activate report that he does every October for the Wall Street Journal D conference. And
Mm-hmm.
year in and year out, he talks about superfans. And when you talk about superfans, which is really the core of a community, and it's the most monetizable, the people who will pay for subscriptions, who will go beyond the paywall, it's equally important for news and information.
Yes.
And to me, the other thing is, I noticed this first with eBay. It was early in Jason Calacanis with weblogs.
Yep.
You're basically not writing articles that have a beginning, middle, and end. As he would say, it was hard to hire in those days magazine writers because they actually wanted to end something.
Mm.
Whereas his writers would say, I'm going to put this out there and I think I'll get a sandwich and see what comes back. The need to be heard is not new. We just have the ability to do it today when we didn't before.
So let's talk about before. You mentioned you're a product of the Northeast Bronx. You went to Bronx High School of Science, a very prestigious New York City school.
It was a school you didn't get beat up at. And sometimes you did.
Well, there's a school that wouldn't even send me an application, let's be honest here. But you wind up the valedictorian of that class, and then you go up to this little town called Cambridge outside of Boston, and you get your BA at Harvard, you get your MBA at Harvard, and then you get your MS in health policy. How did that come about?
You leave yourself available to the unexpected. And I always tell everyone, whether it's my kids or my colleagues, because they would say, why are you wasting time with these people? Because out of that unexpected sort of serendipitous walk through the world, you make sometimes your lifelong friends. You learn things you otherwise might not learn. You can correlate things that you thought were uncorrelated. I'm a product of great good fortune. My mom was a ward clerk at Bronx Municipal Hospital, at Jacoby Hospital, where gunshot wounds were kind of what was going on. She literally filled out charts, but affiliated with it was the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which was a private medical school. So I got the acceptance from Bronx Science, and in it, it's for reasons I still don't remember, and we're no then, it said you needed to do a directed research project. And I thought I had to do it right then, as opposed to junior year when the letter actually said you had to do it. So I took the number 9 bus down Eastchester Road to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And you have to imagine this is in prehistory. And, there's no security. And I walked into the medical sciences building, and I walked up to the second floor because it was the first floor you got to above the first floor. And I walked down the hall in the neurology department and walked into the office of a bearded, bespectacled, pipe-smoking Professor William T. Norton. He was working on the early structural work, understanding the myelin sheath, principally on multiple sclerosis grants, because that was the application. I said, can I stay? And for reasons that, once again, are the serendipity of life and what you have to pay forward, he said yes. And I spent 6 years between junior high school, and summers in college in his lab working on neurological experiments. That and being first in your class at Bronx Science gets you out of the Bronx. Now, my dad and I walked down Eastchester Road and into that drugstore. And I had this I remember it very distinctly. I can picture it exactly. This little kind of purplish blue bag with kind of like vinyl black thing. And it was not very expensive. The pharmacist came over and said, in the most condescending way, it makes you look like a doctor. And my dad said, well, he's going to college, and we wanted to get him something to take with him. To which the pharmacist said, where are you going to college? And my dad said, Harvard. And I still remember that. His entire body demeanor changed. And he said, maybe you can be a doctor. And we need to change for everybody that condescending, you can't do it attitude towards, show me what you can do and let me help you do it. Now, in my case, serendipitously, I went to Harvard and I was a chemistry major. I was the worst chemistry major in the history of Harvard. My advisor was Conrad Bloch, a Nobel Prize winner. He thought I was, he didn't quite say it in this way, but much like the pharmacist, he actually had reasons for thinking I was a complete waste of his time. And I took most of my courses in fine arts, and I was on the Lampoon. And I socialized. and I learned the things. I spent time beginning to understand what excited me. So as opposed to being on a path that everyone wanted me to be on, I think I got a sense of what my destiny might be, but no idea how to get there. And, the good news about chemistry is no one asks you how you did. When you say, what did you major in? And you say chemistry, they don't have a follow-up question. It's like, like what was your thesis on or something like that. And my girlfriend in college, a woman named Joanne McManus, flippantly said, I think I'll apply to the School of Public Health. At which point, I don't know why, but I had 3 years and enough credits to graduate after 3 years, but I was treasurer of the Lampoon and I didn't want to leave.
Sure.
And I figured the only graduate school I could talk into taking me without an undergraduate degree was the School of Public Health. So I wandered over to the School of Public Health and applied to a Master of Science in Health Policy and Management, figuring, given the fact that my grades were not all that great in chemistry, that it was a hedge against getting into business school. And I said, if I don't get into business school, I'll have this. And then after 4 years, I graduated college at that point because they did give you your degree. This is 1977. And I applied to business school. And once again, a complete surprise in many ways, I did get in, even though I'm not sure why. And then I had to talk the two schools into taking the second year of the public health program, which was meant to be done at the business school, with one extra course. And in 6 years, got 3 degrees. And then I was one of
Amazing.
3 people, I think, in my graduating class at business school and public health school without a job. And I've never been west.
You were too busy.
Well, I'd never been west of West Virginia, where I went to the National Youth Science Camp in my high school senior year. And it was 2 students from each state. My friend Tim Goligoski said, you're going to go to California at Christmas because you've never seen California. I'm not sure how my parents paid for any of this or how I did. I did work. And he said, I'm going to take you out driving because you're going to crash. You haven't driven in like 5 years. So we drove around icy Boston, and I went out to California and for the first time, other than in a driver ed course, really drove a car and saw what the beauty of, Southern California, and then tried to interview, which was very hard. And at the end of business school, I didn't have a job. And I literally got on a plane, came west, cashed in the bar mitzvah bonds, and interviewed with anybody who would see me. I mean, we had done
Why LA? What was the attraction there? Just the weather?
I said, if I could get somebody to pay me to watch movies and television, that's for me. Because ultimately, when you think about it, I was in the basement of the Fogg Art Museum, and Emily D.T. Vermeulen, the legendary professor of fine arts and Radcliffe professor, was teaching art history. And Fine Arts 13 was the beginning course in art history. She flashed up a slide of the Acropolis. And she said, how many of you have been here? 2/3 of the room raised their hand. And I turned to the girl from New Jersey with wealthy parents sitting next to me who would never go out with me. And I said to her, Greece is not your first trip to Europe. Greece is at least your second trip to Europe. And I had never traveled. I mean, the first time I used the passport was after school. I'd never gone anywhere outside the US. Whereas my children were literally, my son Joe flew to Spain with me at 11 months. And, to the world we lived in, people would take classes to go look at what a plane looked like, as opposed to the world we live in today.
Sure.
And, I learned everything I knew from books and TV and movies. I knew more about Paris than people who had been there many times because of the entertainment I had watched and paying attention in a meaningful, in a lean-in way to sort of immerse myself in those stories. And I figured this is the greatest gift, is to bring this to others.
Back when you were working with De Niro, and he made that comment to you about when you asked him, what about this film interests you? And he said it was the character and it was ability to learn something about himself and to experience something he hadn't experienced before. There runs a parallel in terms of your experiences too. The indication is that he, in his craft, gets so into a character and that character's experience that they become a part of him.
That is why every one of those clients was a master of their craft. Because, it's not like you turn it on and off like a faucet. You actually have to emotionally invest yourself. It's funny, I've been watching Costner on Yellowstone.
Another client of yours?
Yeah, but the Kevin I know is not the John Dutton on that series.
No?
And, John Dutton is a rough kind of guy. How he deals with his family, how he deals with his community. And I look at what Kevin has accomplished, and you think about the other roles that he has played and how diverse they are. When you choose being a thespian, being an actor as a profession, you are making a commitment to be authentic, to channel characters that you may know nothing about, to be,
or maybe not even like.
I remember once, we ran into Spike Lee, and I was leaving dinner with Robert De Niro, and Spike came up to him and said, "You didn't do the right thing." To which he said, "I just didn't see myself in that character." And I don't know all the reasons he didn't do that. Danny Aiello did it, and he did it brilliantly.
You sure did.
But people make choices. If you have the luxury of making choices on creative issues as opposed to financial issues, and some people who need to do it on financial issues actually still don't. So it was Marty Baum was one of the partners at CAA. He started in vaudeville. And when Mike and Ron and Bill were in the television business, Marty was the anchor. He had Peter Sellers. He was the anchor for the film business. He also was the only agent for Sidney Poitier.
Wow.
And if there are many people I miss Sidney Poitier. Very few people have the historic stature and impact of a Sidney Poitier.
And a deep, deep man in terms of his thinking, his sense of history and where he sat in that continuum of history.
Well, I'll give you two sort of images of Sidney Poitier. I was sitting with him, and we won't go into what the difficult family tragedy was of the person we were sitting with. And I was making small talk because you had to fill the time because you're all sitting there with someone's personal tragedy in their family. And Sidney was there with me, and it was my boss, and it was just us. And we started to talk about libertarian economics. And he wanted me to explain more completely libertarian economics. And I said, well, the fallacy with libertarian economics is that we all start from the same starting point. So it's all merit. Mm-hmm. To which he looked at me with extraordinary laser-like gaze and said, tell me about it. I grew up indigent on Cat Island. And, come from Cat Island to being maybe one of the most revered statesmen, entertainers in the world, civil rights movement, a man whose dignity we should all aspire to.
Yep.
And, then there was a story at Marty's. So Marty was his agent. And, Marty actually started in vaudeville. It was amazing. There were still people who could touch. I actually dealt with people who dealt with Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. When I started in my career at MGM, we hired Sam Marks, who had been hired by Irving Thalberg as the story editor at MGM, and that was like one of the most powerful positions in Hollywood. He bought all of the books and plays and everything else.
Yep.
So Walter Mirisch got up to tell a story, and he said Marty called him, and he said, "I have a young actor, a black actor, and he needs a job. His wife is pregnant, and he has no money." And he asked him to have him audition for a role, a small role in a film. And of course, Walter said, of course. And Sidney went and auditioned, and then nothing. At which point, Walter and the director called up and said, he was magnificent. We offered him the role. And Marty called him and said, well, why didn't you take the job? You need the money. To which he said, what the character represented and what the character said was not dignified for a black man. And I will not say those words.
Interesting. And he's a man who needed the job.
He desperately needed the job. Yeah, and I've never criticized talent that wants to go to work for money. I've done those deals. I remember once, we won't go into which of the clients it was, but he had done a film that I had brought him into, and it was one of those films where it didn't represent the full. It was well made. It was brilliantly made, but it was, I remember there was a poster with the naked body of a woman and then his face and money raining down on it on a bus. And I said, should we change that? To which he said, remind me why we did this film. And other than it actually was well written and it was hugely successful. I said, for the money. And he said, let them do it. And his attorney at the end of this, who handled his wills and estate, called me and said, you've just refunded his retirement. Thank you.
There's no day like a birthday. It's a time to celebrate. Every year, every wish that brought you to this point. Wrapped in birthday love, toasting a future as bright as the moment before you. The best gift is each other.
Now, you mentioned CAA in those days. CAA, give us a little color there, Sandy. How did that happen? It was very different than any other talent agency at the time. And it came from nowhere and became the powerhouse in the entertainment industry. How'd that happen?
Well, I think what happened was, I'm blanking on his name, who was supposed to be running the television division at William Morris, was not given the job. And Mike and Ron and Bill and others, Roland Perkins was the first president of CAA, Mike Rosenfeld. Morris was a very structured, very old company. At the bottom of the page, it said, put it in writing, because you got paid on paper that had numbers on it that you had delivered. And this is kind of like how a real estate agent works. It's more like how the business works today, sometimes how, investment houses work. And they wanted to build a very different company, a family company where it was going to be a collective effort and murderer's row. Plus, it does help that these are some of the most talented agents in the history of the business.
Sure.
and persuasive people, beyond visionary, persuasive. And, I came out to LA in 79 without a job and somehow got an interview at CAA. And I do want to, and while he wouldn't want me to tell the story, because I actually am so grateful for my experience there, I had two contacts. So with Mike Rosenfeld, who has passed away, his son is still there and a great, great human being. Both of them are. Rob Rothman was Mike Rosenfeld Sr.'s assistant. And when, he didn't hire me, but he met with me. And I remember Rob, who now runs a very successful television agency of his own, very successful, one of those names you don't hear, who's at the top of the knowledge and cares about his clients and has done extraordinarily well. He actually ran after me as I left, and he made a point of staying in touch. And that came into play later on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had supposed to have met with Ovitz. He told Stephanie to talk to me. And I remember calling Stephanie and saying, she said, well, Mike told me to talk to you. I said, would you mind if I came in and met you? She said, that's not necessary. And that was over.
Mm-hmm.
And what ended up happening was I ended up at MGM. And I thought I was going to be there forever. I didn't realize there were stable companies like Warner Brothers at the time and unstable companies like MGM, which was going through massive transitions. I was there for Dick Shepard running the studio, then David Beagleman, then Freddie Fields. I lasted through 3 regimes.
Yeah, but 3 amazing personalities and talents in your industry.
And very different. And as I've often said, and it's in the book as well in Powerhouse, I said, you learn as much what not to do from your bosses as what to do. And the trick is not to mimic them. It's to analyze them and then choose for yourself the right path.
There's some great, great advice for young people, actually for everybody there.
Somehow I got hired by Jack Gordon, may he rest in peace, to be his assistant, which meant I ran pay TV. MGM was a tiny company. It didn't even distribute. It distributed through UA at the time before we bought UA.
Uh-huh.
And I was running pay TV under Jack, and I was his assistant in international distribution. And then somehow moved into production. I don't know who I convinced or how I convinced him. And I think David Chasman, who was the head of production under Beagleman, basically thought because I went to Harvard, going back to the credential, I might be able to keep up with him because he had never gone to college and he had a photographic memory.
Hmm.
And he was unbelievable. He would sit there doing crossword puzzles the way, you would fill out a questionnaire. But he was a lovely man and a man of great interesting taste. He was called Dr. No because he said no to everything. But it was a great time. I remember, I first met Sidney Poitier at MGM, and it was one of the great lines. I was sitting like a hassock in his office, and he and Poitier were talking, and he said, Sandy went to Harvard and Harvard Business School, at which point Sidney pointed out Alan Hirschfield and said, Alan Hirschfield, who was running Columbia, also went to HBS, to which David Chasman said, yeah, but then Sandy joined the circus, which was kind of how I felt about it. So when I was at MGM, think about a world with no cell phones, no faxes, no texting, no email, no nothing. And, we'd send telexes when I was, at the company before MGM, which I was at for a short period of time, called Producer Sales Organization. But so I'm at MGM and there are no video machines. CAA had no budget to rent screening rooms for young agents. So Todd Smith, Mike Menschel, Judy Hoffman, every time I screened a movie that I thought was interesting, I would call them and say, do you want to come watch it with me? And gradually, Jack Rapke, I got to know these people. And they basically, principally Rapke and Menschel, who are two extraordinary, not just agents, people, went to Mike and said, you got to hire this kid. And finally, Mike, after years, I had been fired by MGM, by Freddie, because he needed my office. And we won't go into why. But the person who got the office never worked in the business again. But in any event, so I was fired. And one of the things I had done, we had gone in to pitch. So David Gerber, nobody really wanted, who was probably 50% of MGM's television business. But nobody in the movie business wanted to deal with them because movies and TV were like, dealing with TV people was in those days a major step down and seen as not relevant. Yeah. So I had David as an account I looked after. Peter Chernin was there. Sagansky had just left. And Jeff Sagansky. And I get fired by Freddie, which was more of a real estate deal than a performance issue. And the MGM publicity and marketing department, which is a tiny company, Deanna Wilcox said, we're going to do something. Now, in those days, as I say, there's nothing online. There's just Variety and the Hollywood Reporter. Third page of the Hollywood Reporter was an article, third page, that printed my resume. Unfortunately, the headline you can't control. And the headline was Climan ousted at MGM by Fields. At which point I said, I'm not important enough to be ousted. It's like more like, showing the door like a mouse. And David Gerber calls. We had pitched Freddie on a movie, what ended up being a TV pilot called Lady Blue. I was pitching a female Dirty Harry. And Freddie, who had made Looking for Mr. Goodbar, Lipstick, all these salacious movies, looked at David and said, this is immoral. You can't have a woman do this. This is immoral. And I stood my ground and said, we could do this. And, it's a moment that I probably, there are those things you can't explain to your parents. So we're walking down the hall after being yelled at by Freddie while I'm still an executive at MGM. And we go into Madeline Warren's office, who's a vice president. And Gerber throws me up against the wall and grabs my balls and says, the kid's got balls. Make this fun. So now I'm fired, and David pulls me into his office, which is the fourth floor instead of the third floor of the Thalberg building, and says, I was on the can reading the trades, and it said you got fired. So why don't you come work here? Unfortunately, I had an interview with CAA the next day and with Ovitz. And I turned to David and I said, do you mind if I let you know tomorrow? And he looked at me as one would to an unemployed junior executive. and he said, what is there to think about? And I saw the job offer disappearing. So I said, okay. And he said, great, we're all going to the Dodger game. Probably the least fun thing I can imagine is going to a ball game and, right around then. And so I go to see Mike the next day with Ray Kurtzman, who is the legendary head of business affairs and one of the great human beings. When I joined CAA, Ray said, You think you know stuff, you know nothing. You're going to try to do stuff. I'm going to tell you it's going to take you 2 years to even know where the door is. You know nothing. He says, you're going to think you know how to do it, but you're going to fuck up. So come to me. And he was right. It took 2 years. It's kind of like moving to another city and they say, you're a native of that city. After you've been there for 2 years, you kind of know your way around.
Yeah, yeah.
So I go see Ovitz, and he does the sort of amazing stuff that he would do in those days. So after he determined that I was not a complete waste of time, he hit a button on his phone, and you realize that his assistants were waiting for signals to pull me out of there. And he then turned off the phone, so the room was not being monitored by his assistants. And he said, I'm going to put you in a closet, which he did. The closet was opposite his office. It was this, you could get up, but that was about it. You wouldn't lie down in this thing. And he said, I don't know what I'm going to do with you, but you've talked to me about investment bankers I don't know. You've shown me an article from Channels Magazine, which Merrill Brown was publishing and Norman Lear owned, that profiled all of the investment bankers changing the industry. And at that time, investment banking and the industry were very far apart. There was not much to do.
Yeah.
And he said, look, he says, I don't know what you're going to do. So he turned off the phone. And then I said, Gerber or whatever. And I said, I'll just do a whoops and just, come here. I said, just tell me I can sweep the floor and I'll come here. And I think Bill Haber blocked me from coming because Bill told me that, which I respect, by the way. I mean, he did not want Mike building his personal staff larger than it was. And, Bill's a very gifted guy. Mike's an extremely gifted guy. Ron is an extremely gifted guy. And they each worked with each other in ways that were almost as if they should have been together in what was effectively the same dynamic many families have, which is there's a lot you like about each other and a lot you don't like about each other, but it somehow works and you kind of make it work. And he didn't hire me, and I went to work for Gerber. I then ended up running 2 small film companies. At the end, and I had sold Lionsgate Studios, not the one you know today, but the one that Robert Altman founded.
Oh, okay.
And I had sold that facility, which was making fairy tale theater, but also doing a lot of post-production. It was a very educational time to run a small company. I sold it to New World. And Ray Kurtzman calls up and says, what you doing? And I said, well, I'm interviewing with ICM. And I was on my way to be a television packaging agent at ICM.
Mm.
And he said, maybe we shouldn't be talking. At which point I said to him, as I had said before, if you give me a broom and a job at any price, I will come sweep your offices. And that's how I got hired 6.5 years later. And Mike hired me, Ray, Bob Goldman was our CFO. There were 3 guys who owned the agency at that point, 2 guys, then 3 guys, including me, who helped run the agency. We built the corporate side of the business. I co-founded, I founded it.
That was a radical departure to have a corporate side of the agency.
Remember, we didn't operate like anybody else. Because of Mike, Ron, and Bill and the stature of the talent that we represented as a corporation, as an agency, we had access to Rupert Murdoch. I remember Jim Burkus came to visit me when he was having an altercation with his partner, Marty Baum. And he asked me to smooth it out after I had left CAA. And at one point he said to me, Sandy, you don't understand. He said, you guys are talking to people we don't reach. And now they do, but at the time they did not reach. He said, You're dealing with heads of companies and global companies because of who you are. And we were a murderer's row. I mean, remember, behind every layer of the agency were the best agents in the business and the best environment in the business and the best compensated. It was a small company. And it moved like a family and an army. And it was fantastic. And the people who did that are, every one of them, as far as I'm concerned, legendary thinkers, strategists, and managers of talent.
You mentioned along the pathway there when your resume was published, you mentioned one of the places it wasn't published was in Variety. And we have a mutual friend who ran Variety for 25 years, who hailed from the same borough of New York City as you do, the Bronx, and ran Variety for 25 years from New York. Jerry Byrne.
Oh, Jerry, who I talked to this morning.
Oh,
I talked to Jerry this way. By the way, Jerry, the genius of Jay Penske, he and Jerry exemplified to me, like you, the best in management. They manage with vision and heart. They always ask, I was on the board of Penske Business Media until it rolled up into the parent company.
yep.
Because I had introduced Jay to Dan Loeb, not for funding, but Dan eventually, when Shamrock pulled out of the financing of the acquisition of Variety, Jay had already bought Deadline, but the next acquisition was Variety. Dan called me up one day and said, I know you, but I don't know anybody else in the entertainment industry, really. Who should I meet? And I said, well, there's the obvious candidates, but there's young guy Jay Penske, and I think the world of him. You should meet him. And he did. And then when Shamrock bailed at the 11th hour on the acquisition of Variety, Dan wrote the check. And he once said it was one of his smallest deals. It was one of his most profitable deals. And it was one of the best relationships he ever made in a company that he funded. And they're friends to this day. And I ended up on the board of Penske Business Media. And I never was in a discussion with either Jay or Jerry, but a lot of it was with Jay. He didn't ask under difficult circumstances what the right thing to do was.
Mm-hmm.
When provoked by people who had strong personalities, you know who I'm talking about. He always did the right thing, and he still does.
That's great.
And he's turned that into a far-ranging, data-centric, global enterprise that is the future of entertainment. People think of it as entertainment journalism. It is far more than that.
It sure
It
is.
is the data that runs and the back end that runs the entertainment business.
I bet our listeners would like to hear how you think about what our friend Jeff Sonnenfeld introduced in December at the last Yale CEO Institute Summit, which was the ChatGPT story generation capability. And then what about you've been involved in 3D early with U2 3D, the metaverse immersive entertainment. What can we expect in the next couple of few years? The impact of these new technologies will be around us yearning for, wanting to be immersed and entertained.
I used to be the youngest guy in the room. I still think I'm the youngest guy in the room, which is truly delusional and very hard. But my goal is to give back. And what I see going forward is the following. And one of the things that has been marvelous in the 23 years since I made up Entertainment Media Ventures and convinced people it meant something, which I'm not sure that it does. But the bottom line is we try. Look, I've hosted heads of state. I go, why are they? By the way, the best one was when I was hosting King Abdullah from Jordan after the first year of the Syrian refugee crisis. And I was talking to the protocol office for the Jordanians, and I said, and I know King Abdullah from the World Economic Forum. By the way, one of the most amusing moments was he was walking down the hall of the Seyhaf Hotel, which is a diplomatic hotel there. And I said, King Abdullah, and three guys ran at me that were very large. At which point, King Abdullah said, Sandy, and they stopped, which was very fortunate. But they said to me, I said to them, why did you ask me to do this? And they said, because we know you will get it done. And then they said, would you mind partnering with Mark Burnett? I said, absolutely. And, it's the ability to get it done. It's the ability to actually make yourself of service. And my goal has always been, and I know you've talked about this on other podcasts, it is what it means to be in a life of service to others, no matter what you're doing. The minute you think you're more important than somebody else, you have failed as a human being. I give back in two ways. One is cross-cultural storytelling, because we are on a global platform. We are developing tools that, as I'm helping the Saudi Film Academy think through their future, I say, don't look at legacy models. Look at what the future of digital technology will bring. Put that in the hands of your extraordinary young population. Train them for the future, not the past.
Leapfrog.
And the genius will rise. And the other is, I want to create jobs, because I see us in a dark place. And whether it's America or the world, and the only thing that, social media fails us, media fails us. You know what doesn't fail us? Communities, religion, and wanting to make a better life for your family. So OptiCareer, which is a pre-skilling platform, is I guess what people are calling it now, takes high school students and gives them training, authentic training, certification, works them through their interests, and gives them internships, pre-internships, internships in association with companies that are not the FANGs. They're not Facebook. They're not Google. They're Snap-on Tools in Kenosha, Wisconsin, because a kid from Kenosha, Wisconsin is not going to Palo Alto. He's staying in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And, I was talking to Nick Pinchuk, who's a legendary CEO, and also, Nick from the Yale CEO Leadership Institute. Nick is America to me. He's a Vietnam vet. He makes the best tools in the world. He touches 1 million people when he sells something like 80 Snap-on jackets a week at full price, because people want to have Snap-on on because they're so proud to work with the best tools, and the people who know.
Yes.
But I said to him one day, I said, how much of what you're doing is digital? He says, what do you think a car is? It's a computer. And, so they have, every company has needs that are being unmet. There are hundreds of thousands of unfilled jobs. And, I was talking to one professor at a major Ivy League school, and he said under 7% of the entering class actually are liberal arts majors. We have entire divisions that have no students. And he said, everybody is here, and they're all, because they can get their general education, and it is about lifelong education on the internet. What they want is a path to give themselves and their families a better life. And OptiCareer is a company that is we will measure our success by how many people go into jobs at companies. I'm having dinner with Lockheed Martin on Sunday with my friend Leo McKay. I don't know who will sign on for this, but everybody is focused on the fact that we want recruitment and retention is everything. And we want our young people excited about the future so that they are not tearing each other apart. If you think about my career, I'm not sure about yours, because I think you were an entrepreneur a lot earlier than I was. But I had mentors, and even if they weren't mentors, they were role models.
Yes.
And you could learn from them. I want to give young people a disciplined path so that they don't feel lost, so that they have a purpose in life. And at the end of it, whether they go to college or go right into the workforce, that they are not functioning members of society, but people who are fulfilling their lives in work and home communities where they are very happy with the quality of life they have.
I had a chance to play golf this weekend in Palm Springs, and I had a young caddy assigned to me who's a terrific young man, 22 years old, just graduated from Kansas University as an Evans Scholar, youngest of 6, tough household, tough upbringing, but somehow it produced this wonderful young man. And your program would be so appropriate for people like him, because we did a lot of chatting about careers, and he, because he hasn't worked other than as a caddy growing up because he was good at it and he's a good player. He was a captain at a Kansas University golf team. He didn't really understand all of the possibilities of career path. He only knew baker, lawyer, doctor, Indian chief. He didn't know all the other possibilities. And my recommendation was to go work someplace, just get into a company and learn about all the different avenues, all the different paths. And that's what your program at OptiCareers with your partner, Albert Chow, are doing. They're creating an opportunity for people from different circumstances to get a peek into what that big world is like out there, so that they don't feel locked into the things they think they know are the 2 or 3 or 4 career options that they have. There are so many more, but they just have to get educated before they get educated.
Well, the interesting thing, and I know we're going to wrap up, is say that you're gone from this earth when the last person who remembers you is gone from this earth. Mark Damon hired me when nobody would hire me. Richard St. John's told Mark Damon to hire me.
Mm-hmm.
Jason Rabinowitz looked at how much I was earning and what was going on as I was a second secretary at Producers Sales Organization, and he said, come to MGM. I didn't care how much MGM paid me, and they paid me less than they paid people who worked in clerical jobs in the lab. But they said, we know you're here for another reason. And Jack Gordon gave me the entry. David Chasman elevated me. David Beagleman, I learned from Beagleman. I learned from Fields. It didn't matter what happened. From there, I ran 2 small companies. Robert Chester gave me the opportunity to run Lionsgate, not the Lionsgate, but the other Lionsgate. And at the end of that, Mike Ovitz hired me. Ron Meyer took me under his wing. Bill Haber, as much as he would look at me as part of Mike's entourage, I learned enormously from him, and he was quite kind to me, as were Bob Goldman, Ray Kurtzman, and all of my colleagues at CAA. The Universal, where Ron and Edgar Bronfman, and eventually Frank Biondi, who I miss terribly. And at the end of the day, after that, in my own business, there are people who have constantly changed my life. Some of them in places. I own a piece of an Indonesian film company. How does that happen? You're working with young Arabic, brilliant creators in the Middle East. I know producers who have won Academy Awards. I was allowed with my friend Michael Mann, who saved me after I needed a job, and he took me in as his partner. And, we produced The Aviator together, which meant I sort of sat around and was in awe of Marty Scorsese, Leo DiCaprio, and Michael Mann. Because, if you look at it, it's zebra, giraffe, hippo, brick wall. I'm the brick wall. So, it's like, what doesn't fit?
Produced that wonderful movie, which won the Golden Globe for Best Picture. What an exciting opportunity that must have been.
Well, but the point is, in your life, people change your life. My goal is to take young people, and I'll tell you one last story. So it was 2019, just before the pandemic, and Hamish Norton, who I went to college with the year after me, William T. Norton's son, called me up and said, "We're having a memorial service for my dad. Would you come?" And it was a small group. In fact, they were all researchers from all over the world, and they all talked about what Professor Norton, who was in the science community an icon, but everywhere else no one knew who he was. And I walked in, and Bob Ledeen, who worked in the next lab, was there, and I introduced myself, and he glazed over. And I went up to speak, and I spoke about paying it forward. And he said afterwards, "You were the kid. You were the kid in the lab." And I said, "Yeah."
Back there at Albert Einstein School of Medicine.
And the bottom line is, we need fewer bullies, more people who are good colleagues, good values, caring people with leadership of quality, as opposed to leadership in the ways that we know it shouldn't be. And that's what every one of us, and I know you do this, that's what every one of us has to focus on.
Well, Sandy, you're a gift. Every time I run into you, and I've run into you in Europe, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in the Middle East, and I always light up because I get a chance to talk to you, learn from you, and hear stories that I learned so much from. And my takeaway from today was early in our conversation. I want to make sure that I talk to the young people at Flowers and to my own kids about being available for the unexpected. And that's one of the many but endearing lessons of your life, and one that I'm sure our listeners will take away today. Thanks for being who you are, being so generous with your time, and sharing with us your genuine wisdom.
Well, thank you for being an amazing friend. Thank you for all you do for so many. And you have an extraordinary family. You have been a gift to everyone. So, if people are listening, all I can say is there's a lot of talk about actually the fact that we need to do better. From Jim and myself, and I'll speak for Jim, activate that. Actually go figure out ways, random acts of kindness, ways to invest yourself, whether it's family, friends, or even those you've just met. When someone looks like they are in trouble, don't pass by them. Find out if they are, and then help them.
We put our heart into everything we do. We are farmers, bakers, florists, and makers who grow and create with a passion. Made with love at every step of the way. Because at the end of the day, we know you're sending more than a gift. 1-800-Flowers, share with love.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to Celebrations Chatter. You can join our community by reaching out at chatter@celebrations.com. And while you're at it, tell us what topics you'd like us to explore. here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to share it forward.